She walked into the ocean, and the world assumed she drowned. Another stormed out of her home one night and was never seen again. One woman's body was pulled from the Hudson River, her death so baffling it inspired Edgar Allan Poe himself. And then there was the most famous case of all, the Queen of Mystery staging her own disappearance so perfectly, people are still arguing over what really happened. History is littered with strange disappearances, but when it's women at the center, the stories take on a darker edge. Their vanishings weren't just police matters, they became scandals, front-page sensations, whispered rumors passed from one generation to the next. Some of these women were adored by the public, others vilified. A few left behind trails of evidence that raised more questions than answers. And in every case, the truth was swallowed up by time. In tonight's video, we're exploring 6 of the most haunting vanishings in history. A glamorous actress who boarded a ship and never made it to shore. A prodigy novelist who walked out of her front door and simply ceased to exist. A courtesan whose brutal death was brushed aside by a jury. And even the greatest mystery writer of all time, who lived out her own unsolvable riddle. Each of their stories is tangled with intrigue, scandal, and unanswered questions, and each one proves something chilling. Sometimes the greatest mysteries are not written in books, but lived in real life. So stay with me, because every story you're about to hear is stranger than the last. It's late afternoon on a crowded California beach. Families splash in the waves, radios hum from the sand, and the smell of salt water hangs heavy in the air. A woman walks toward the water, lifts her skirt, and steps into the surf. She wades farther out, and then she's gone. People scream. Some think she drowned. Others swear she simply vanished. By nightfall, the shoreline is lit with candles, prayers whispered into the wind. Coast Guard cutters sweep the bay, divers plunge again and again, and in a desperate attempt, authorities even dynamite the ocean floor, hoping to force her body to the surface. The blasts kill fish, but bring up no woman. Days pass, then weeks. A follower drowns searching for her. A professional diver dies trying to recover her body. Newspapers fan the flames, printing ransom notes, rumors of plastic surgery, even whispers of a secret lover. And then, 36 days later, a woman stumbles out of the desert on the Mexico-Arizona border. Her hands filthy, her shoes coated in white dust, her body trembling. She tells a story of abduction and escape. But nothing about her story adds up. This wasn't just any woman. She was one of the most famous voices in America. She built Angelus Temple in Los Angeles, a massive 5,000-seat sanctuary packed to the rafters every night. She ran her own radio station, KFSG, preaching across the airwaves into living rooms nationwide. To millions, she was more than a preacher. She was a star. So when she vanished, it wasn't just a local story. It was a national crisis. Crowds gathered outside her church, praying and weeping. The press couldn't get enough. Hearst newspapers printed front-page headlines daily, and even author Upton Sinclair wrote a poem in her honor. For her followers, her disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was unthinkable. It was May 18th, 1926. She headed to Ocean Park Beach, just north of Venice, with her secretary. The plan was simple: a short swim before her scheduled sermon that evening. Some say she went into the water, got caught by a current, and never returned. Others insist she walked away on purpose. Back at Angelus Temple, when she didn't arrive for her sermon, her mother took the stage and stunned the congregation. Through tears, she declared, "Sister is with Jesus." The city erupted. Vigils spread across the beach. Divers searched the bay, Ransom notes poured in, one signed The Avengers. And soon, sightings of her popped up everywhere. A woman who looked like her in Chicago, another in Oakland, another in the desert. For weeks, Los Angeles lived in suspense. And then, on June 23, 1926, she was found. In the desert town of Agua Prieta, Sonora, across from Douglas, Arizona, she stumbled into a hospital, disoriented, claiming she had been kidnapped and escaped by cutting her ropes with a tomato can before walking 17 hours through the desert. Her miraculous return was met with parades, flowers dropped from airplanes, and crowds numbering in the tens of thousands. But not everyone believed her, and soon, investigators would uncover details that made her story look less like a miracle and more like a scandal. It's June 23, 1926, more than a month since she vanished. In the border town of Agua Prieta, Mexico, across from Douglas, Arizona, locals are stunned when a woman stumbles out of the desert. Her hands are filthy, her shoes coated in white dust, her face trembling with exhaustion. At the hospital, she whispers through cracked lips, "I was kidnapped." The story she tells is dramatic. Two men and a woman lured her from the beach under the pretense of prayer, only to abduct her. For weeks, she claims, they held her captive in a desert shack. She says she was bound, guarded, and told she'd be ransomed. Then, in the dead of night, she managed to cut through her ropes with the jagged edge of a tomato can, slipping away barefoot into the desert. She claims she walked 17 hours through the sand before reaching Agua Prieta, and to many of her followers, this sounded like nothing short of divine deliverance. If you take her story at face value, it reads like a thrilling escape. She even provided names for her captors: Steve, Jake, and Mexicali Rose. She described the shack, the threats, the long walk across the border. Supporters pointed to her appearance as proof. Witnesses in Arizona noted her hands were cut, her shoes frayed, and her body weakened. They argued these were the marks of someone who had truly endured an ordeal. And when her train carried her back to Los Angeles, the city erupted in celebration. Tens of thousands flooded the station. Airplanes dropped roses from the sky. To her followers, it wasn't just a return, it was a miracle. But miracles rarely hold up under investigation. As the confetti settled, detectives began poking holes, and the first name they landed on was Kenneth Ormiston. Ormiston was a married man and a radio engineer at her station. Around the time Aimee vanished, he quietly left Los Angeles. Investigators discovered he'd rented a cottage under an alias, the same weeks Aimee was missing. Neighbors swore they saw a woman resembling her at that cottage. Grocery slips in the trash seemed to match her handwriting. To skeptics, the puzzle fit perfectly. Aimee hadn't been kidnapped at all. She had slipped away with her lover, and the kidnapping tale was just a cover story once the affair risked exposure. The church pushed back hard, but the press devoured the scandal. Was the preacher America adored really capable of such deception? Here's the problem. Both stories leak truth and lies. If she was really kidnapped, why were there no arrests? The shack she described was searched, but evidence was thin. Distances didn't quite match her timeline. Her captors' names sounded more like dime novel villains than real people. But if she staged it, why put herself through public humiliation? Witnesses in Arizona swore her hands were cut, her shoes ruined, her body exhausted. And if she had been hiding in comfort, why arrive trembling, filthy, and half delirious? Each theory explains half of the picture, and each leaves half unsolved. By late 1926, Los Angeles was obsessed. A grand jury was convened. Aimee and her mother were indicted on charges of obstruction and conspiracy. Headlines screamed scandal. But in January 1927, the charges were dropped. The district attorney admitted the evidence was too thin. Aimee walked free. Her ministry never truly recovered its spotless image, but her church endured. Some remembered her as a miracle worker. Others swore she was a master manipulator who staged her own greatest mystery. Even today, historians are divided. Was she truly the victim of a bizarre abduction? Or did she slip away with a lover, only to return when the walls closed in? And while the world debated, another woman boarded a ship that same decade and vanished without a trace. The passenger who never arrived. It's late October 1919. The ocean liner RMS Orduña glides into New York Harbor after 11 days at sea. Families gather at the pier, passengers stream off the gangway, and stewards haul luggage ashore. But one first-class passenger never steps off. Her name is on the manifest. Her luggage is stowed below, and her stateroom is booked. Yet when the ship is searched, not once, but 3 separate times, she is nowhere to be found. Theories spread faster than the newsboys can shout. Did she fall overboard? Was she murdered in the night? Or had she staged the greatest vanishing act of her career? This wasn't an ordinary traveler. She was an actress, known on both sides of the Atlantic. On stage, she played sultry vamp roles, but she was just as famous for her daring turn as a male impersonator, striding across the stage in tailored suits, monocle flashing under the lights. By 1919, she was 35 years old and well known in theater circles. To the press, she was a magnet for drama, a woman who blurred the lines between performance and reality, which meant, when she disappeared, nobody could decide, was this a tragedy or another performance? The Orduña had sailed from Liverpool, paused in Halifax, and was making its final approach to New York. Her stateroom, number 480, opened onto an interior passage. The porthole was only 13 inches across and locked from the inside. A stewardess brought her dinner, then returned at 9:30 p.m. with sandwiches. By morning, the food was untouched, the bed unslept, and the woman was gone. Witnesses remembered her the night before, dressed in black, a heavy veil across her face, the glint of a monocle. She seemed cheerful, even relaxed. But by the time the Orduña docked, her stateroom was empty. Her luggage sat untouched below deck. Weeks later, the trunks were shipped back to Liverpool. And 2 years later, in 1921, she was declared legally dead, authorities marking her as another passenger lost at sea. Except, some whispered she hadn't drowned at all, that she had walked away from the ship in disguise, slipping into the crowd as a sailor or fireman, never to be seen again. When stewards realized she was missing, they tore through the ship, every stateroom, every storage closet, even the lifeboats. Nothing. Her stateroom 480 was locked from the inside. The tiny porthole was shut tight, the bed unslept, the dinner untouched. It was as if she'd walked straight off the ship in the middle of the Atlantic. By the time the Orduña docked in New York, rumors were already spreading. Some whispered she'd fallen overboard in the night. Others imagined a violent crime at sea. But there was one more theory, that this actress, known for stunts and disguises, had staged her own vanishing act. The official stance was simple. She jumped or fell. Her luggage remained untouched in the hold. She never reclaimed her trunks. In 1921, a court officially declared her dead, lost at sea, presumed drowned. They even marked her coordinates, 70 miles off Cape Cod. Supporters of this theory pointed to her state of mind. Some claimed she was struggling financially. Others hinted at depression, a dark, lonely voyage ending with a desperate choice. It was tragic, but at least it made sense. But skeptics weren't satisfied. They pointed to her past, the costumes, the male roles, the habit of stepping into new identities. Witnesses swore she'd been seen on deck in men's clothing, passing as a sailor. One rumor claimed she disguised herself as a fireman and simply walked off the Ordunia with the crew. Then came whispers of a publicity stunt. Her name had been fading from the headlines, until now. And the biggest name linked to that theory was press agent Walter J. Kingsley. Some said he'd helped her vanish, feeding newspapers just enough to keep the mystery alive. If true, it worked. Her disappearance was front-page news on both sides of the Atlantic. But the truth was never proven. And to this day, no one knows if Marie Empress was lost to the sea, or if she simply slipped into another role, leaving the stage forever. Theories swirled, but neither ever fully held. If she truly drowned, why was her bed unslept? Why was her dinner untouched? Why was her porthole locked from the inside, as if sealing a mystery no wave could explain? But if she staged her own disappearance, the contradictions cut just as deep. Why leave behind every trunk of clothing? Why risk everything she'd built for a publicity stunt that gave her no payday, no encore, no second act? If she escaped in disguise, why never write, never return, never resurface under another name? Each theory explained just enough to survive, and left just enough unanswered to keep the case alive. 2 years later, in 1921, a court declared her legally dead. The official cause: lost at sea, presumed drowned 70 miles off Cape Cod. Her unclaimed trunks were shipped quietly back to Liverpool. But the mystery didn't fade. For decades, her name resurfaced in gossip columns, stage histories, and books about great vanishings. Was she a tragic passenger who slipped into the Atlantic, or a performer who vanished into a role so convincing the world never saw her again? 100 years later, we still don't know, and she wasn't alone, because 20 years after Marie Empress vanished at sea, a literary prodigy walked out of her home after an argument and was never seen again. A story without an ending. It's a cold December evening in Massachusetts, 1939. Dinner has ended. Voices rise in a small apartment, and then the door slams. A young woman steps out into the winter dark with only a notebook tucked under her arm and about $30 in her pocket. No coat, no suitcase, no explanation. She walks down the street and vanishes into the night. For 2 weeks, no one reports her missing. By the time her name finally appears on a police bulletin, the trail is already cold, and the world will never see her again. This wasn't a stranger no one noticed. This was a woman who had once been called a genius. As a child, she invented entire languages and worlds, writing in notebooks before she was even 5. At just 12 years old, she published her first novel, The House Without Windows, to glowing reviews. Critics compared her to literary giants. The next year, she sailed aboard a Nova Scotia schooner, turning that adventure into her second book, The Voyage of the Normandy. She was the kind of prodigy who filled headlines, the girl who could conjure entire universes before most children could write an essay. But early fame is a double-edged sword. Her father left the family, her publishing support crumbled, and by her 20s, she was working as a secretary while chasing bigger manuscripts that no publisher seemed to want. Behind the image of the gifted prodigy was a woman carrying disappointment, responsibility, and a longing for escape. On December 7th, 1939, she and her husband, Nickerson Rogers, were living in Brookline, Massachusetts. That night, after what he later described as a trivial argument, she put down her pen, stood up, and walked out. She carried $30 in cash. She took her notebook. She left behind her coat, even though the New England winter was setting in. Nick expected her to cool off and return. But she didn't. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. 2 weeks passed before he went to the police. When a bulletin was finally issued in April 1940, it went out under her married name, Barbara Rogers, and barely made the papers. By then, the trail was long cold, and the prodigy the world once knew had simply disappeared into silence. Nickerson Rogers expected his wife to return after cooling off, but 2 days passed, then 5, then 2 weeks, still nothing. When he finally went to the police, he made a surprising request: no publicity. He said Barbara had run off before, back in 1929, when she was a teenager stranded in California. She had turned up in San Francisco, alive, but humiliated by the headlines. Nick didn't want a repeat. So, for months, no one outside Brookline knew she was missing. When a bulletin was finally issued in April 1940, it was under her married name, Barbara Rogers. By then, 4 months had passed. The press barely noticed. The trail was already cold. Some believe Barbara never meant to come back. She had a history of running, to ships, to mountains, to faraway towns. She loved Squam Lake in New Hampshire, where she and Nick had spent summers hiking. With $30 and a notebook, she could have boarded a train north and vanished into the wilderness she adored. Supporters of this theory point to her restless spirit. She had once created entire fantasy worlds as a child. As an adult, when her marriage faltered and her career stalled, maybe she decided to create a new life of her own. But if that's true, why was there never a trace? No letters, no bank withdrawals, no sightings that held up. A woman who lived on the page, who had once written so much, leaving nothing at all. Another theory takes us back to New Hampshire. In 1948, almost 9 years after Barbara vanished, human remains were found near Durgan Brook in Holderness, not far from Squam Lake. Authorities said they belonged to a local woman named Elsie Whittemore, missing since 1936. But some details didn't match. The glasses, the shoe size, the personal effects that family members didn't recognize. Later re-estimates of the bone's height fit Barbara more closely. She and Nick had even rented a farmhouse nearby. To some researchers, the evidence suggests the body was hers, that she walked into the pines with barbiturates and ended her story alone. But the remains were never DNA tested. Officially, they weren't Barbara's. And once again, the truth slipped back into shadow. There's one more theory, and it points closer to home. Some suspect Barbara never made it past the apartment door. They look at her husband, Nick. He waited 2 weeks before going to police. He asked for no publicity. Years later, he remarried. To those who doubt him, the delays and silences seem too convenient. Did he know more than he said? Was there a fight that went further than either expected? But there's a problem. No evidence, no witnesses, no crime scene. Just suspicions, written between the lines of a cold case file. And so, the case circles back on itself. If Barbara started a new life, where are the letters, the manuscripts, the footprints of her genius? If she ended her story in the New Hampshire woods, why did officials insist the remains were someone else? And if foul play silenced her, why has not a single shred of proof ever surfaced. Each theory makes sense in half light and collapses under full sun. What remains is the image of a young woman walking into a winter night with $30 and a notebook, and leaving behind nothing but questions. In the years that followed, Barbara's absence became her epitaph. With no body, no trail, and no explanation, the courts eventually declared her legally dead. Her notebooks and unfinished manuscripts were left behind, gathering dust in boxes instead of filling shelves. Her husband remarried. Life moved on, but whispers of her disappearance never stopped. For decades, scholars and readers have returned to her story, the prodigy who burned brightly and then vanished. Her novels were reprinted, letters resurfaced, researchers pieced together her lost works, and each rediscovery only sharpened the mystery. How could someone so gifted, so alive on the page, leave the world without a single trace? Barbara's fate is still unsolved. What remains are her words, and the silence where her ending should have been. The Vanishing Cigar Girl. It was a sweltering July morning in 1841 when a small group of men strolled down the Hoboken shoreline to escape the city's heat. Their destination was Sybil's Cave, a tourist spot where visitors could sip cold mineral water and watch the river flow. But before they reached the cave, one man stopped. He had spotted something floating in the Hudson, something tangled in the reeds. At first, the crowd thought it was a bundle of rags. Then, as the waves shifted, the truth came into view. It was a young woman, pale, motionless, her dress torn and heavy with river water. When they dragged her to shore, gasps rippled through the crowd. Her arms and torso were mottled with bruises. Some said her neck bore the marks of strangulation. Others swore she looked peaceful, as if asleep. But one thing was clear: this was no simple accident. Within minutes, the whispers began. Murder. And soon, the entire city would know her name. But who was she? And why did half of New York already know her face? This wasn't the first time New Yorkers had obsessed over this mysterious young woman. 3 years earlier, in October of 1838, she had suddenly disappeared. Friends reported her missing, and the press jumped on the story with frantic energy. The penny papers ran headline after headline: a young beauty vanished without explanation. Theories filled the city. Had she been abducted, killed? But just as quickly as she had vanished, she returned. The newspapers printed sheepish retractions, calling it a hoax. Some even hinted it had been a publicity stunt cooked up by her employer, a clever way to draw men into his tobacco shop. Others whispered she'd staged the disappearance herself to teach her admirers a lesson. Whatever the truth was, the city never got answers. The whole incident was brushed aside as a joke. But in hindsight, it feels more like a grim rehearsal. If it was meant as a joke, no one was laughing when she vanished again. On Sunday, July 25th, 1841, she told her fiancé that she planned to spend the day with relatives. It was an ordinary excuse, nothing that raised suspicion. But instead of visiting family, she boarded a ferry bound for Hoboken, New Jersey, a popular getaway spot across the river from Manhattan. Witnesses recalled seeing her walking along the shaded paths near the river. Some swore she wasn't alone. A few claimed she was in the company of a man they didn't recognize. And later that evening, locals reported hearing screams echoing from the wooded area near the water. But Hoboken had a rough reputation back then. Gambling dens, taverns, and gangs were never far away. so the cries were brushed off. By nightfall, she hadn't returned home. By the next morning, her friends grew worried. And 3 days later, the Hudson River revealed what had become of her. The newspapers would dub her something unforgettable, and the mystery of her death would haunt America for decades. By the next morning, the city has a name. The papers splash it in thick, black ink: Mary Rogers. If you lived in Manhattan, you already knew that face. Not from the theater, not from a ballroom, but from a tobacco shop. Behind a polished wooden counter, under a halo of cigar smoke, Mary had become a kind of celebrity. Men who had never bought a cigar in their life found reasons to visit, just to be served by the quiet, poised young woman with the luminous eyes. The shopkeeper didn't mind. His sales soared. The penny press loved her too. Columns about the beautiful girl behind the counter, about the crowds she drew, about how the city itself seemed to pause when she smiled. But fame in a city like New York is a double-edged thing. Admirers become watchers, watchers become a crowd, and a crowd can vanish when a girl needs help. Mary's mother swears her daughter was cautious. Her fiancé insists she was careful and kind. Still, there had been trouble before. The first disappearance, years earlier, the one the papers called a hoax, left a bad aftertaste. People changed their stories. The truth felt slippery. Now the questions come fast and cruel. Did her fame draw danger to her door? Did someone follow her from the shop to the ferry, from the ferry to the woods? Or, whispered even softer, did Mary go to New Jersey that Sunday to meet someone she knew? She was the girl everyone recognized, until the city recognized her in the worst possible way. The shoreline becomes a theater. Crowds press in. Vendors hawk lemonade to people who came to gawk. Uniformed watchmen, underpaid, untrained, overwhelmed, try to clear a path. Reporters elbow to the front, scribbling details that will be retold a dozen ways by sunset. Bruises, torn fabric, a ring that may, or may not, have slipped from a swollen finger. Some swear her face shows the calm of drowning. Others insist they see the violence written on her skin. The coroner's words are careful, maybe too careful. The city doesn't want careful, it wants a villain. Theories multiply like flies. A gang dragged her into the trees. A jealous admirer lost his temper. A stranger from the ferry. The watch system, those half-awake nightmen, takes heat for failing to keep order across the river. But the crowd is not there for policy. They're there for blood, for certainty, for a name they can hiss when they go home. By evening, the riverbank empties. Lanterns bob away. The papers will do the rest. They'll headline it with a phrase so catchy that even people who never set foot in a cigar shop will know it by morning. And once a story like this lands in the penny press, it stops belonging to the truth. It belongs to whoever shouts the loudest. Tomorrow, the city will wake to a chorus of headlines, and none of them will agree on how Mary died. In the weeks that follow, one figure keeps returning to the river. He moves quietly, as if afraid the water will recognize him. Daniel Payne, Mary's fiancé. He retraces her last day. The ferry dock, the path under the trees, the tavern with the swinging sign, the mouth of the cave. Witnesses say he asks the same questions over and over, as if the place itself might finally answer. Grief turns to ritual. Ritual to obsession. And obsession, left alone long enough, starts making awful suggestions. One autumn night, Daniel walks back to the very stretch of shore where the crowd first gathered. He carries a small bottle and a small piece of paper. The bottle holds laudanum, opium, in a dark, liquid lullaby. The paper holds a single line for the city that would not stop staring. To the world, here I am on the very spot. By morning, they find him. The note is read and reread, printed and reprinted. Some call it a confession, others call it proof of a broken man condemned by gossip. A few whisper that guilt and grief can look exactly the same from a distance. Whatever it was, the river has claimed another life. And still, the truth about Mary has not surfaced. Daniel's goodbye gives the city another headline, but not the answer it wants. The ink on Daniel Payne's suicide note was barely dry before the city launched into its favorite sport, speculation. The gang theory came first. Hoboken had a reputation. Rough taverns, gambling dens, back alleys where fights ended in blood. Some papers insisted Mary had been dragged off by a group of rowdies, assaulted, then dumped in the river. It was lurid, it was easy, and it sold copies. Then came the jealous admirer theory. Mary had no shortage of attention. Maybe one man mistook her polite smile for something more. Maybe rejection turned to rage. A stranger with too much drink in him, or worse, a familiar face who couldn't take no. And finally, the darkest theory of them all, the abortion rumor. Some whispered that Mary hadn't gone to Hoboken for leisure, but for a procedure she couldn't get in the city. A young doctor, perhaps, or the notorious Madame Restel, whose name already filled the papers. It was whispered she had died not by violence in the woods, but by a table in a hidden room. Each version fed the papers. Each version kept her story alive. But every theory still had one thing in common: no proof. Theories multiplied like headlines. But the truth was buried deeper than the river itself. More than a year later, the case explodes again. A woman named Frederica Loss, keeper of a Hoboken boarding house, is injured in a family quarrel. As she lies near death, she summons a magistrate. What she says stuns him. According to Loss, Mary had come to her house that summer in the company of a young physician. The visit wasn't for leisure, it was for a procedure. Something went wrong. Blood, panic, the young woman slipping away on the bed. In desperation, the doctor and Loss decided to move the body, carrying it through the night to the river's edge. Loss swears it's the truth. But when her words hit the papers, the authorities shrug. No arrest, no charges. Some say the confession was muddled by fever. Others say the police had no stomach for exposing the underworld of abortion in the 1840s. The public is left with more smoke than fire. And Mary Rogers becomes less a person, more a symbol of gossip, of rumor, of the secrets women carried in silence. A confession had surfaced, but even on her deathbed, the truth refused to stay clear. While the police stalled and the public argued, one man saw something different in Mary Rogers' death: a story. Edgar Allan Poe was living in New York when the case broke. He followed the papers like everyone else, but where others saw rumors, Poe saw material. Within a year, he published a new tale, The Mystery of Marie Roget. The setting was Paris, the victim renamed, the detective his beloved C. Auguste Dupin. But anyone who read it knew it was Mary's story. At first, the story mirrored the headlines. Poe wrote with confidence, even arrogance, that Dupin's reasoning would solve the case once and for all. But the problem was the case itself wouldn't stop changing. New evidence surfaced, new theories spread. Even Frederica Loss's shocking confession forced Poe to revise his drafts. What had begun as a confident retelling soon became a moving target. Still, what Poe created was historic. It became the first detective story ever based on a real crime. In some ways, Mary Rogers's tragedy gave birth to a new kind of literature. Readers devoured it, not just because they wanted to know who killed Mary, but because they wanted to believe that reason and deduction could cut through chaos. But in reality, the chaos never ended. Mary's killer was never found, and the case that inspired Poe's fiction would remain unsolved, leaving Dupin victorious only on the page. Her death gave us detective fiction, but never the justice she deserved. By the time the headlines faded, Mary Rogers was no longer just a young woman from New York. She had become a cautionary tale, a symbol, even a legend. Her death exposed a city that wasn't ready to protect its own. In 1841, New York still relied on watchmen. Part-time, poorly trained, easily distracted. Mary's case, and the public fury that followed, highlighted just how fragile that system was. Within a few years, the city created a new force, the NYPD, a modern police department, born partly from the failures her story revealed. But Mary's legacy wasn't just in law and order. It lived in literature, in the way her tragedy became the scaffolding for detective fiction. Edgar Allan Poe gave her a second life in Marie Roget. Readers chased clues in the safety of fiction, even as the real mystery remained unsolved. And it lived in whispers, about women's choices, about hidden procedures, about the dangers of secrecy in a society that left women little protection. No matter which theory you believe, gangs, a jealous lover, or a botched operation, the truth is that Mary Rogers's story ends the same way, with a body in the Hudson and a question mark that still hangs over it. A city learned from her death. Literature was shaped by it, but justice, that never came. Ashes and alibis. Just before dawn, the city is a maze of quiet cobblestones and shuttered windows. Then a shout splits the dark. Inside a narrow house off Thomas Street, smoke pushes under a door, the bitter reek of lamp oil burning too hot. A door crashes open. Someone coughs, someone cries out, and a few frantic hands yank back a smoldering coverlet. On the bed lies a young woman. Her nightdress is singed, her skin marred, the pillow stained. Near the hearth, a small lamp turned high. On the floor, the glinting edge of a hatchet, half hidden by fallen fabric. The room feels staged to burn, just enough to hide what really happened, not enough to erase it. Downstairs, a housekeeper sobs to anyone who will listen. There was a late caller, well-dressed, soft voice, a face the house had seen before. The neighbors gather in the hallway in their stockings, whispering the same words as the smoke curls up the stair. Murder. A room meant to burn, a weapon meant to speak, and a city about to listen. By daylight, the house returns to what it pretends to be, respectable enough from the street, careful curtains, a quiet stoop. Inside, it runs on rules. Appointments logged in a tidy hand, aliases for gentlemen who never want to be gentlemen here. The city knows places like this exist. It just pretends they don't. Late at night, carriages roll up with their lamps dimmed. Money changes hands. Some callers are awkward, some are cruel, some are dangerously charming. Last night, there was a boyish one, too well dressed for the hour, gloves immaculate, voice low. He climbed the stairs with a soft laugh and shoes that barely touched the treads. Downstairs, a clock ticked through the minutes like a witness. In a house built on secrets, the smallest lie can sound like truth. Sometime after midnight, voices upstairs rose and fell. Never a shout, just the sharp edges of a quarrel, sanded down to whispers. A door closed. Footsteps crossed the floor, then quiet. Minutes later, another sound, the scrape of metal. The pop of a lamp turned high. A neighbor would swear later she heard nothing at all. The housekeeper would swear she heard something but couldn't name it. The city will decide what they heard for them, what no one saw. A figure slipping back down the stairs, gloves now tucked away, face turned from the light. The latch clicked. The street swallowed the sound, and upstairs, the room began to smolder. He came in like a gentleman and left like a ghost. By morning, the name is everywhere. Not Dorcas Doyen, the farm girl from Maine, but Helen Jewett, the woman New York already whispered about. She wasn't a secret. In fact, she was a sensation, stunning, sharp, self-possessed. She had reinvented herself, moving from a hard childhood into the orbit of powerful men who paid handsomely for her company. Her beauty and wit made her more than a face in the parlor. She was a celebrity in a city that pretended women like her didn't exist. Clients remembered her striking looks, her confidence, her ability to disarm even the most arrogant gentleman. The papers painted her as both victim and villain, fallen woman and tragic heroine. Her past was suddenly dragged into daylight, every detail twisted to fit a headline. But behind the print, behind the scandal, Helen was flesh and blood. A young woman, barely in her 20s, cut down in her prime. She had built a new name for herself, and in one night, it was turned into a headline. The investigators combed through the room. What they found became legend. The hatchet still glistened faintly in the lamplight. The lamp itself had been turned so high it scorched the air. The bedding was burned, but not consumed. The fire set to conceal, not destroy. Witnesses described a young man seen slipping from the house that night, his gloves tucked away, his face half hidden. But testimonies wavered. Some swore they recognized him, others hesitated, afraid to name a gentleman in public. Still, the evidence piled up. A cloak left behind, a footprint in the garden, a watch that matched the suspects. Every scrap was seized by the penny press and splashed across broadsheets by dawn. Yet for all the clues, the case felt murky, as if someone had carefully staged the scene to confuse. A room full of clues, but each one pointing in a different direction. Before long, suspicion settled on one man, Richard Robinson, a 19-year-old clerk. Well-dressed, well-spoken, polite. He had visited Helen before, using the alias Frank Rivers. When police confronted him, Robinson barely flinched. He denied everything, cool, calm, untouched by panic. To some, that composure made him look innocent. To others, it made him look like a killer who believed the rules of class and gender would shield him. At trial, the courtroom overflowed. The press reveled in every word, turning testimony into theater. Helen's letters were read aloud, her reputation dragged through the mud, as if her character were on trial, more than the man accused of killing her. Witnesses contradicted one another, evidence blurred, and Robinson's defense leaned hard on the unspoken rule of the time. Men of status were rarely punished for what happened in houses like hers. The verdict would stun the city. He walked into court accused of murder and walked out into history. If the courtroom was crowded, the newspapers were bursting. Competing editors printed every rumor, every scrap of testimony, whether it was fact or fantasy. Helen's private letters were splashed across front pages, her character judged more harshly than the man accused of killing her. Some papers painted her as a seductress who had courted her own doom. Others called her a victim of a system stacked against women. The penny press turned her murder into a morality play, one that reflected the anxieties of a city divided by class, gender, and power. The trial was about Robinson's guilt. But on paper, it often read like Helen herself was on trial. In the court of public opinion, Helen Jewett's name was the real evidence. The trial dragged on. Witnesses contradicted themselves, evidence blurred, and the defense leaned heavily on class. How could a respectable young clerk, so well-dressed, so polite, be guilty of something so brutal? The jury returned after only 2 hours. Not guilty. The verdict shocked half the city. To Helen's defenders, it proved what they already knew. Her life, her reputation, and her gender weighed more heavily than any weapon or witness. To Robinson's supporters, it was a victory for a young man wrongly accused. But the truth was simpler. Justice in 1836 was not blind. It looked at status, it looked at gender, and it looked away from Helen Jewett. The hatchet had left its mark, but the law left her behind. Richard Robinson walked free. He left the courthouse with a confident stride, his name technically cleared, but his reputation forever tangled with the murder. He slipped quietly from public life, rumored to have moved abroad. The boarding house where Helen lived and died closed its doors, its rooms emptied, curtains drawn. For years afterward, New Yorkers whispered about the case whenever they passed Thomas Street. For some, the lesson was about morality. For others, it was about money, power, and how justice bent toward them. For Helen's friends, the lesson was crueler, that a woman's life could be erased by the same men who once paid for her company. The killer walked away, but the city could never quite shut the door on Helen Jewett. Helen Jewett's murder didn't just scandalize New York, it changed it. The case became one of the first true crime sensations of American history, proving how the press could shape public opinion and turn tragedy into spectacle. For women, it revealed the brutal reality of reputation in the 1830s. Innocence or guilt often mattered less than how society judged your character. For journalism, it was a turning point. Sensational stories sold, and truth came second. Helen's killer was never officially named. Her story remains unsolved, an open wound in the city's past. But her case lit the fuse of American true crime, the blueprint for every headline-grabbing mystery that followed. She was silenced by a hatchet, but her story gave voice to a nation's obsession with crime. But Helen wasn't the last woman whose disappearance left a city gasping for answers. Our final story belongs to a young socialite who vanished in the heart of New York City. Broad daylight, Fifth Avenue, 1910. Her name was Dorothy Arnold, and despite endless searches, private detectives, and headlines that gripped the nation, she was never seen again. Her story is too big to fit into this video, so we're saving it for our companion podcast. Join us next Tuesday, September 30th, when the full episode on Dorothy Arnold drops on our podcast. The link will be in the description once it goes live. Until then, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week with more strange history.